Good evening to all of you. On behalf of our director, Professor Shailesh Nayak, and our chairperson of our Consciousness Study program, we welcome you for the today's Swastra Botany public lecture series. So our today's speaker is Dr. Soumyabrata Choudhury from JNU, who is Associated Professor in School of Art and Aesthetics, and he will be speaking on the topic between Dionysus and Plato, is there aesthetic thinking in Greece? So as you are aware of, the lecture would be of 30 to 40 minutes, which will be followed by the question answer session of the equal duration. And the vote of thanks will be given by Hari Krishnan, who is doctor scholar in NIAS CSP program. So Dr. Soumyabrata Choudhury is a very well-known scholar in the continental philosophy and performance studies. So just give a very brief introduction of him. So he has done his PhD from Center for English Studies, JNU, and he has been the fellow and taught in the prestigious institutions like Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, Center for Studying Developing Society, CLTS, Delhi, CSSS, Kolkata. And currently he is faculty in the Theatre and Performance Studies, Schools of Art and Aesthetics. So he has published a lot. Some of his books are Theatre, Number and Event, which explore the relationship between the theatre and mathematics, published from the NIAS Shimla. And his recent book is Ambedkar and Other Immortals, an untouchable research program, which is published from Navayana. Besides, he is also deeply involved in theatre productions and acted, scripted and directed many plays based on the Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Premchand, Mukti Bodh. And he regularly organizes the theatre workshop with differently able people in Delhi with NGOs. And with these words, I invite Professor Soumyabrata Choudhury for the today's talk.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Very kind of you. So I'll speak briefly for 30 to 40 minutes on the relationship of art and truth in the specific context of Greek culture, ancient Greek culture, particularly the period from the 5th century BC to 4th century BC, marked by the presence of two of the greatest philosophers in Western philosophy, Plato and Aristotle. And I'll do it with a specific question in mind, which is simply this, that is an aesthetic thinking possible? Why do I ask this question? Because on the one hand, and this is something we were discussing in the morning with a whole lot of students here, on the one hand, aesthetics as it was positioned by Immanuel Kant in his first book among his trilogy, Critique of Pure Reason, aesthetics pertained to the very conditions of any kind of thinking or any kind of conceptual understanding. So in the first book, Critique of Pure Reason, aesthetics does not refer to the work of art at all, but it refers to the sensible conditions of any conceptual grasp of phenomena. And to that extent, the question was not so much whether it was possible for any thought to happen without an aesthetic materiality underlying it, but that whether that materiality itself is thinkable. In other words, are the conditions for thought already given to us from outside thinking? Or is it possible for thinking to grasp the world in all its appearance, in all its sensible appearance, in and with a categorical or conceptual framework? This was the question that, with reference to the specific experience of the work of art, Immanuel Kant dealt with in his third book, which is the book of aesthetics called Critique of Pure Judgment. But the difference from the modern period marked by Immanuel Kant and the ancient Greek period is this, that in the ancient Greek period, no such subject of aesthetics or no such subject who is in a position of externality or autonomy to judge the work of art or to have an experience of the work of art is posited by any of the Greek thinkers. So it seems that in ancient Greece, art is already immersed in the social milieu, in the cultural world, and the cultural world cannot be separated from specific experiences of artistic practices. There is no universal subject which can be posited or which can be imagined to experience art from a position of externality. To that extent, it seems that ancient Greek philosophy of art is already highly specific to the presumptions and the premises of that culture. And at the same time, we know that it is with the Greek philosopher Plato that a theory of truth is for the first time in Western philosophy enunciated as a universal theory. So it seems that in Greek history, and hence the question also becomes historical, there is a contestation. There is a moment of equivocation or ambiguity, where on the one hand we see with the emergence of Plato's work, equally the emergence of a universal theory of truth, or a theory of truth which pertains to what Plato calls the eidos, the universal form of the idea. And on the other hand, at the same time, Greek culture is seen to be a very specific form of culture, incommensurable and superior to all other forms of social and collective and communitarian life that existed at that time. So just to illustrate this point, you would know that the main protagonist of Plato's dialogue, Socrates, is somebody who was put to death because he's said to have brought in false gods, new gods. He's supposed to have corrupted the youth and so on. But he was given an option. He was given the option by the Athenian court in 5th century that he could go into exile or he could stay in Athens and die. And he chose to stay in Athens. Why did he do that? And Socrates said, I must stay in Athens even if I have to die here, because Athens is the only civilized city. That is, Athens is the only truly humanized city in the world. Every other city, every other human habitation is not human enough. To that extent, even if I live as a living body, as a kind of living animal, that existence outside Athens will not be a human existence. To that extent, I'd prefer to die in Athens than go and live and survive somewhere else. So this is clearly a very, very ethnocentric or ethnocentric view of the world, where the entire world is judged from the particular view of Athens as the center of the world, as the only civilized center of the world. So it is interesting that Plato is somebody who both proposes a universal theory of truth, which is apparently not based on any particular empirical historical reference, and at the same time, Plato belongs to a culture which is absolutely singular in terms of its claim to civilization or any kind of proper philosophical existence, which other cities and other societies are deprived of. So it is within this paradox that we need to investigate, both historically as well as philosophically, what is happening with the question of art and truth. And that is what I would like to simply present to you in a brief, modulated form, certain results of my investigations into this question from pre-Plato to Plato's time, which is 5th century, and how the problem is partly not solved, but displaced in Aristotle, who works in the 4th century. So this historical summary hopefully will have some consequences for our general considerations of whether aesthetic thinking is possible and whether the relationship of art and truth translates into a possible program for an aesthetic thought. So let me quickly summarize for you my findings about the historical development of this relationship of art and truth in ancient Greece. So in 5th century BC, when Plato is someone who forms the academy in the city of Athens, and he is doing his work in the middle of 5th century, which is 450 BC, let's say, which is a time of democracy in ancient Athens, with the well-known democratic leader, not king because it's a democracy, but what was called in ancient Greece strategos, or magistrate, the democratic leader, the democratic governor, Pericles. It was during the time of Pericles that Plato is also doing his work, and Plato is seen to have an extremely complicated relationship with the primary festival of ancient Greece at that time, which is called the city Dionysia. The city Dionysia is a theatre festival that happens twice a year, and it is a theatre festival which is done in the honor of the god Dionysus. But the god Dionysus himself is not someone who exists only in the 5th century. On the contrary, the genealogy of the god Dionysus, or the history, the prehistory of the god Dionysus, takes us back to the time of Homer and other Greek writers from the epic period, from the earlier archaic period. From at least 7th century onwards, or even before that, we find traces of the god Dionysus. And the god Dionysus is seen as a god not simply of one particular kind of cultural activity or a festival, but as a myriad, as a multiple functions god Dionysus had. So for instance, in the period in the 6th century, before the 5th century emergence of Greek city, god Dionysus is seen as an agricultural god mostly. But around agriculture developed several cults of the earth, cults of fecundity, cults of fertility. And god Dionysus symbolized the god who, in a sense, was the patron god under which these cults functioned. But by the time we reach 5th century BC and Athens as the central city of ancient Greece has emerged, god Dionysus has become a city god. So the god is also called a god of the politis, politis meaning what in the modern context we call politics. The Greek word politis means constitution. So now, god Dionysus is not simply a cultic god, but a constitutional god. He's a civic god. And he's a god under which the city's cultural activities take place. And the central cultural activity is the city Dionysia. And the city Dionysia is a remarkable occasion when most of the city assembles in one place. Of course, the nature of the festival is complicated. I don't have the time to go into that. It is a processional festival. It starts off with a procession, but ultimately it results in a congregation, an assembly around the altar of Dionysus in the city, in the amphitheater. And in the altar, a whole series of cultural activities take place, the chief among which is the performance of the play, a tragic play. But of course, these performances are not simply performed for the audience, they're also competitions. So the word agon. So agon is a word which means contest, in which someone loses and someone wins. So these festivals are also agonal. They are contests in which plays are performed, and then some of those win the prize for that particular season's festival. So the great Greek playwrights like Sophocles and Aeschylus all won prizes during these festivals. So the festivals can now be seen clearly in many layers. So on the one hand, these are religious festivals or ritual festivals where Dionysus is the main god. But on the other hand, these are civic festivals, and to that extent, all performances also have a certain kind of scenographic autonomy. So in a way, the history of theatre and the history of philosophy both begin during the period of democracy in ancient Greece as autonomous activities. But they're not really autonomous because they do take place within a ritual context. And Dionysus is a god, and yet Dionysus is also a civic god, not simply an old rural or agricultural god. It is within this kind of a complicated structure that we see the god Dionysus being a sign, being some sort of an envelope under which a specific set of transformations take place within this city context, which I will call, and in my work I have called, a liturgical transformation. So I'd very quickly like to point out to you and tell you what I mean by the logic of liturgy, or what is a liturgical transformation. One of the interesting things that I discovered in my study of Greek history was that, and these are not only from primary sources but also from secondary sources, was that in this period, in 450 BC, Pericles, the leader of the Greek democracy, Athenian democracy, instituted a fund, a certain amount of money, which was a government fund, which was supposed to be disbursed to the citizens of the Greek city, whether they be poor or rich, to everybody, like a dole. And the purpose of this disbursement was that the citizens used this money for certain civic activities. So for instance, I'll give you just two examples from the different civic activities. One civic activity that it was meant for was buying of food grain. So it was a dole which was meant to be spent for buying of food grain. So all men, whether rich or poor, citizens. So the meaning of citizen has to be very clearly understood. They are men, not women, who belong to the household. They are non-citizens, not foreigners, not children, not slaves, because this is a slave society. But only men, born of Athens. So that's why it's ethnocentric patriarchal society. But within that there is a kind of equality. Whether rich or poor, these men would all take part or be given this dole to buy food grain with it. Everyone would pay the same money to buy food grain. So it is not a free market. It's a kind of state-controlled food disbursement. The other activity with which, for which this fund is disbursed is theatre attendance. So it is with the question of theatre attendance that a paradox or a contradiction struck me. That it is the citizens who are given a dole which they are meant to pay back when they enter the theatre. But on the other hand, in the very same theatre, and these theatres, like I said, these Dionysian festivals are huge. Greek cities are small cities. They are more like village cities, not like our cities, these days, not at all. But within those village cities, most of the population assembled for these plays. So which meant it is not just the citizens who assembled for these plays. For these plays, women were also there, slaves were also there, foreigners were also there. It was a hybrid crowd. But only the citizens were given this money to then pay back as theatre attendants. Paradoxically, the women, the slaves, it is possible, were given free entry. So why is it that the citizens are first given a dole which they have to pay back? What kind of a redundant technology is this? Social technology. This is the question that really struck me in my own work. And my hypothesis, which I developed, to some extent, not just in Greek society, but for other societies, was this, that this money is given not as a money credit, but as a cultural credit. So when a citizen is given money to buy food grain, then it is not simply a money for which he is going to pay food grain. He's going to buy food grain with that money. That money is a symbolic marker or a symbol to mark the eating of food of the citizen as significant eating. Not simply the eating which is natural eating, for which we need to survive. Similarly, going to the theatre was not simply a question of going to the theatre as some sort of spontaneous cultural or entertainment, but it was significant civic participation. So this is a word that is used by Pericles in a speech he made, that everyone must participate in civic activities. But everyone meant the citizens. So we have to make a distinction between participation and being physically present. And yet, physically everyone is together. It is not as if the women are, of course, certain parts of the festival women are not allowed. That's true. But by and large, everyone is present together, like in a hall like this. And yet some of us are citizens, some others are not. How to make this distinction, not simply a physical distinction, but a semiotic and conceptual distinction. So in a way, this is called a liturgical distinction. Why? Because liturgy in ancient Greece meant public service. So theatre becomes a kind of public service. Eating food becomes a kind of public service. So when the food is eaten, it is not that the food is simply eaten by people, collecting their own food and eating it. The food is given by the state, which meant the people, that is the citizens, as something that the citizens themselves would then have to redistribute amongst themselves. Theatre is a place of culture or entertainment or whatever, which is not a group of private entertainers or an industry like the film industry performing something for the people's fun or people's enjoyment. Theatre is performed by the public on behalf of the public. So the public is on both sides. And this is the limited but a very rigorous model of democracy, that all culture, all activity, including eating, which is the fundamental act of human survival, when it's a matter of citizens, it is a matter of both happening from the side of the public and at the same time it is happening on behalf of the public. So everyone is eating, but they're eating as if not for the individual survival, but as citizens, that is on behalf of the public. And this money dole is a kind of cultural credit which you pay back with participation. So it is in this particular milieu that Plato is writing. And this is a milieu where Dionysus now means two things. One is Dionysus means the aesthetic transformation, or here the word aesthesis must be understood in the Greek sense. The Greek word aesthesia means sensation, simply sensation, from which, as you understand, the word anesthesis comes. When we take an anesthetic injection, it is the sensation which disappears. So the Greek aesthesia does not mean the subject who enjoys a work of art. The Greek aesthesia means sensation. So the sensation of a work of art, the sensation of a theatre performance, the sensation of a dance, all of that is something which is the larger envelope or field of the Dionysic experience, in which we have to make a liturgical distinction between those who are citizens and those who are not. It is within this immersive and at the same time this discriminative logic that we are confronted with a very interesting division between Plato and Dionysus. This is what basically I am talking about today. So what is this immersive yet discriminative logic? On the one hand, Dionysus stands for the transformation that takes place in anyone who participates in the sense of being present to a spectacle, like a show, whether it be a play or a dance or a piece of music or any other kind of performance. Insofar as you are exposed to performance, you undergo a kind of exposure to sensations that take place. When you see an actor, you feel excited, you applaud, you say, oh, ah. All of these are expressions of sensation. So Dionysus is understood to be a god of sensation. Dionysus is primarily understood to be a god of drunkenness, god of wine. So the other name of Dionysus is Bacchus. Bacchus is a god of wine. But of course, there are other kinds of qualities attached to the god Dionysus. God Dionysus is also attached to the god of animals, someone who transgresses the threshold or the borderline of being human. So the god Dionysus also stands for a god of virile animals. The god Dionysus also interestingly stands for a god who looks like, in his physical appearance, like a woman, for a certain androgyny, for a certain scrambling in the distinction between man and woman. And of course, historically, people have written about this. Martin Bernal has a very great book about it called Black Athena, where Dionysus is also seen as a Mediterranean god who comes to Greece from Asia, as a black god, as a dark god. Again, a hybrid god where the cultural identity of the god or the national identity of the god is indeterminate. But that is the interesting point, that if a god is a god of indeterminacy, then which is that art? Which is that performance form in which indeterminacy itself becomes the logic of performance? And that is theatre, where an actor is by definition indeterminate. An actor can take on many roles. In the Greek meaning of the word persona, prosopon, every actor wears a mask. No actor shows his real face. But you wear several masks. You move from mask to mask. So the word prosopon is actually a very interesting word, because the word prosopon both means mask and face. So the actor is someone in which the mask and the face cannot be distinguished. So Dionysus then becomes eventually also a meta-god, a god of theatre. Or theatre itself is a meta-activity in which all of these distinctions and their scrambling get included. So it is in this kind of a larger field of magical transformation, a field of transformations where transformations are like in drunkenness. Transformations are not in control. You are not in control of your transformation. The wine is in control of you, of your consciousness. In that sense, Dionysus is also a god beyond consciousness. So Nietzsche in the 19th century wrote a book called The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music, and he said Dionysus is a god of music, where music stands for a force beyond consciousness. So on the one hand, we have Dionysus, who is an immersive god, and in no context does the question of truth arise in Dionysus, because every theory of truth is immediately subject to the force of sensation. Dionysus is someone who brings new sensations. Truth is something which is too static, too abstract, too philosophical to withstand this particular force of sensation, which theatre in a sense emblematizes. This is on the one side. And it is within this immersive context that the great enthusiasm of the Greek festivals are being experienced. On the other hand, we have the leading philosopher of that time, Plato, who says that all sensation must be subject to truth, to evaluation by truth. So truth becomes an evaluator of sensation. And so in Plato, we have a new concept, an evaluative concept, which moves between the sensation of performance and the meaning of truth. And that concept is mimesis, which in the Dionysian world is a completely unneeded concept. In Dionysus, the concept of mimesis has very little significance. But with Plato, it becomes a primary operator, because it is with the degree of imitation to the truth that the evaluation of a performance must be made. And performance has to be praised only by its degree of proximity to the truth, which is by the logic of mimesis or imitation. And the moment the theory of mimesis enters the picture, we have a strange correlation or a subjection or a command that sensation undergoes at the hands of truth by the operation of mimesis. But of course, one has to read Plato carefully. And in Plato, there is another word that features in a very important way, apart from mimesis, and that word is methexis. And the word methexis means participation. So even in Plato, there are actually two philosophical notions that both enter into a certain kind of theoretical complicity, but at some points, they also undergo a certain tension between each other. On the one hand, methexis. Methexis means exactly a Dionysic phenomenon, which is that of participation. And mimesis, which means imitation of something which is external to you. So participation means immersion. Participation means entwinement, where you cannot separate one from the other, while mimesis means separating one from the other, putting things in hierarchy, separating the citizen from the non-citizen, man from the woman, foreigner from the Athenian born, and so on and so forth. So it is interesting that in Plato's time, which is the time of democracy, actually, both these forces are in play. One force, which is the force of immersion and indiscrimination, and to that extent, a kind of egalitarian sensational force, an egalitarian subjective force, egalitarian affective force, and on the other hand, a democratic governmental force, which limits the space of democracy to citizens. So in my work, I've called this the original citizen caste in ancient Athens. And Plato is a philosopher of the citizen caste, because Plato himself is Athenian born. But the fact remains that the Dionysian festival itself is something which is not meant only for the citizens. The Dionysian festival, as a total festival, as a total performance, as a show, a lot of historians have called the Dionysian festival to be like, in the modern period, we call the show, in which several items are presented. Not only a play or a dance or a standalone or film, but a hybrid of many items and many kinds of performance styles. So a show like that intrinsically has the power of scrambling the lines of separation, the liturgical lines of separation between what is significant and what is non-significant, what belongs to the citizen and what lies outside the space of citizenship. And in a way, Plato also reflects this tension, because Plato is known, on the one hand, for his censorious attitude to art, that art is something which must not be allowed to enter in the city. But of course, as we all know, in Plato's own work, every example that he takes to illustrate his own philosophical and political points are actually also from art. He quotes Homer, and his love for Homer, his love for tragedy, his love for Sophocles is there to be seen in all of Plato. Socrates himself is supposed to have been wanting to become a comic actor, and by mistake he became a philosopher. So this point of uncertainty, whether a philosopher is actually a comic actor or a comic actor is potentially a philosopher, is already a part of the interest of reading Plato in new ways. But what's interesting about Plato is this, that in Plato there is no theory of art. There is no poetics. There is no aesthetics as a knowledge of spectatorship. There is only one immersive and at the same time highly anxious field, and that is the field of truth. So truth is plunged into the body of Athens. Everything about truth, because Athens is the only true city, everything about Athens is subject to this evaluation by truth, and yet truth must be universal. And so philosophy moves between what Plato wants to make of Athens as a place of extreme vigilance about everything true to be incarnated in the space of Athens, and at the same time a theory of truth which becomes the abstract, highly rigorous, almost mathematical space of philosophy as something which is purely intellectual. So this moving between intellectual and sensational is something that you see in Plato himself. And so the last 5 minutes I speak on how this problem is not solved, but is displaced in a strategic way within 100 years by Plato's student Aristotle. And how Aristotle's definition of tragedy in his book called Poetics offers, again, not a solution, but a negotiation with this extreme anxious discourse in Plato, or this anxious symptomatology of Plato, towards what could be called a therapeutics. So since I'm speaking in a forum which is concerned with health, with indigenous health, I understand, which are very interesting lines of inquiry, I think it would be of interest to you that in Aristotle we find a therapeutic displacement of a philosophical problem. And that displacement takes place or comes with the central definition of tragedy that we encounter in Poetics. So very quickly, that definition is a long sentence. All of Natyashastra is compared with this one single definition, and Natyashastra is such a big work, and Poetics is such a condensed small work with one single line which actually is the center of Poetics. And yet, comparative aesthetics continuously compares, Natyashastra, rasa theory with catharsis. I'll come to that. So what is this definition? This definition you'll find is entirely structural. This definition has no philosophical value beyond the concepts that are produced from within what Aristotle calls the work of poetry. Not theatre, but poetry. And what is work? Work is something that a poet produces as, in the same way that a craftsman produces a craft. The word common to a poet and to the craftsman and to the dancer is technitis. Anyone who has a technique uses the technique to produce a work. And that is poiesis. Poiesis is not poetry. Poetry is a part of poiesis, because whether it's poetry or it's a craft or any other work, wherever the model of the work is something which exists as a prior form to be achieved through a particular technique, that is poetic. Wherever the model exists already, whether you're making a bed or you're making a piece of pottery or you're writing a poem, in each case, Aristotle says, there is already the model of a work which needs to be actualized in the work through the technique of the technitis. So the poet is a technitis. And the tragic poet is, in a sense, the highest technitis, because the tragic poet works with material that is the most developed in terms of civic sophistication, historical sophistication. So that's why in this definition of tragedy, Aristotle says that the essential condition for tragedy to exist is that the protagonist of the tragedy, that is the hero, would be someone whose magnitude must be commensurate with a certain human society. A human society means fundamentally a civilized society. That is Athenian society. The hero must not be either like a god, which is mythical, nor must be someone who is of the magnitude of something so subhuman or so negligible, like a slave or an animal. And commensurately, the hero must use human speech. So the human speech must not be so stylized as to be musical. So you see already how far he's moving from Dionysus. Dionysus is, Nietzsche will say, is entirely a god of music. And Aristotle is saying that actually tragedy is something which is not so hyper-musical or hyper-stylized that it leaves the sphere of everyday speech. And yet, that everyday speech must not be the speech of slaves. It must not be the speech of women, which is sub-literary, or the space of children, or even the tongue of foreigners, because foreigners speak a barbaric tongue. Everyday speech must be the speech of noble people. So there is a clear social discriminator that is being used here, the caste discriminator in my words. But at the same time, all of this has to be mobilized in the direction of what Aristotle calls muthos. And muthos means many things. It can mean myth, clearly. In Greek, you pronounce the Y's with U, so it's a muthos, though you spell it M-Y. So mythos. So it could mean myth, but it can also mean plot. It can, of course, more generically mean fiction. And it can also mean, more philosophically, the world that you create out of the imagination. In other words, in art, you make a work, just like you make a work when you make a bed, when you make a piece of pottery. The only difference is, in art, you make a work of fiction. The fiction is a world that you create. And hence, as against Plato, Aristotle displaces the problem by saying that there is a model available for art which is not based on the universal model of truth. There is a truth of art itself, which is the truth proper to art. In Plato, there is no truth proper to art. Truth is only proper to philosophy. But in Aristotle, there is a truth proper to art. And the truth proper to art is the work of art. In a sense, you are now displacing the question from sensation to the work of art, to a poetics, to a philosophy of art, insofar as philosophy of art means the principles of the production of the work of art. But to what end? Every work of art must have an end, a telos, from which the word teleology comes. And Aristotle says, and this is the final point, that the telos of tragedy is therapeutic. And the famous word that he uses is catharsis. The telos of tragedy is catharsis. But the word catharsis can mean many things. It can mean simply what it is in normal Greek, in everyday Greek. It can mean physical purgation of toxins in the body, or poisons in the body. But it can also mean ritual purification, which, as we all know, is very different from physical purgation. And then it can also mean intellectual elucidation. So Oedipus, one of the main heroes of Greek tragedy, was confused about the truth of who he was. Later, it was elucidated from him that he was someone who has done this terrible thing of killing his father and sleeping with his mother. So it was an intellectual elucidation, but it was also a ritual purification. But the main everyday use of the word in Greek is biological, which is to take out toxins from the body. So one of the curious questions that arises in poetics is, why does a biological word perform an aesthetic function, which is catharsis? The only answer to this is that this word is not meant to be used either biologically or aesthetically. It is meant to be used therapeutically. But this therapeutics is to be immediately seen with another text of Aristotle where the word catharsis comes in, and that is the text Politics. In Book 8, Aristotle says that in the theatre audience, there are always two types of audience. One is the cultivated audience, the other is the audience which comprises laboring classes. For the laboring classes, there is only one kind of enjoyment, and that is cathartic enjoyment. For the cultivated audience, there is cultivated enjoyment. But he also goes on to say that this cathartic enjoyment is meant for all. Which means what? Which means that the higher classes can also enjoy low level of entertainment, can have cathartic enjoyment. This is not therapeutic. This here catharsis is used in a degraded sense. That's something which is mere entertainment, which the lower classes enjoy because they don't have cultivation. They simply enjoy something which is formulaic. So a formulaic enjoyment immediately then becomes something which is a mark of the lower classes. But Aristotle says that this formulaic enjoyment is also something, this low-level enjoyment, degraded enjoyment, is also something which the upper classes enjoy. Only difference is the upper classes are also capable of enjoying something which is of higher nature. But you see how poetics and politics are constituted together. Politics is precisely, from Plato to Aristotle, the art of discrimination. Hence, the upper classes must take care that they don't fall to the level of lower classes' cathartic enjoyment at every moment. They must be able to distinguish within them the lower parts of their soul and the higher parts of their soul, which the lower classes can't. So here the liturgical discrimination comes back through the cathartic method. And the therapeutic theory is immediately complicated by a political theory. And that's why I say, and that's my last point, that aesthetics and poetics are indeed produced by Aristotle not as a solution, but as a displacement of a problem. But any displacement of a problem only postpones the problem. At some point in the future, the problem comes back. And so exactly such a thing happens with Kant and with Hegel in the 18th century when the problem comes back, and Kant now needs again a universal theory of the aesthetic subject. And Hegel both takes that theory from Kant and plunges the theory into history. A new Dionysian history is proposed. And hence, in the preface to Phenomenology of Mind, Hegel says, and he brings together Dionysus and Plato's theory of truth, and he says, the truth is the bacchanalian orgy or the Dionysic orgy from which no one goes undrunk. So now Dionysus has entered into the world as a lived historical world, and yet the lived historical world has become a true world, which is our world. That's all. Thank you.
So thanks a lot, Professor Soumyabrata Choudhury, for this fascinating discussion. Now the floor is open for the questions, comments, and clarification.
Thank you, Professor Choudhury, for that very insightful presentation on this very complex topic. Of course, from a lay understanding, and I suppose, more looking at the spatial aspects of all this, I just wondered if you could throw light, for instance, when you enter the Acropolis, you have the Dionysus Theatre, which is not exactly at the base, but somewhere as you go along, and it's like kind of spiral on one side, and then you go up, and then you're up in the Acropolis. So I can see after your talk where the spatial organization falls in terms of the various hierarchies. So, would you elaborate on that in terms of, the role that it maybe played in terms of, the setting of, the Acropolis, which to me as an art historian seems
No, of course,
very...
So yeah, thank you for that. Now, thank you. I know that you've seen the Acropolis, and that is, I've not been to Athens, but I've seen a lot of images and on archaeological representations. So in the spatial organization of the Dionysian festival, we have to first of all also separate the static part, which is in the Acropolis, that particular area, and the procession. So the processional part probably started from elsewhere in the city. So in a sense, in this respect, it is very close to the Tazia, the Shia passion play. So like in the Shia passion play, the procession itself goes through the city. Now it is in the Shia passion play, of course, it goes through several lanes and by-lanes of the city, whatever the city, in Iraq, Iran, in India, doesn't matter. It seems the Dionysic festival has a path which is more towards the festival site itself, the Acropolis. But at the same time, it is not a static assembly in the Acropolis merely, in the theatre itself. It starts from somewhere outside and then moves into that space. So that dynamic constitution into the congregation, into both the spatial and eventually the ritual congregation, is, I think, the first thing that needs to be noted. The second thing, as far as the spatial organization is concerned, is that in ancient Greece, every spatial unit or level is already something which is conceptually or semiotically bifurcated into political hierarchies, into socio-political hierarchies. This is the interesting thing. Natalie Camden, an art historian who unfortunately passed away, who had come to where I teach as a visiting professor, was speaking to me, and she was a Roman historian. She was an art historian of ancient Rome. And she was the one who pointed this fact to me, and I knew it, but she kind of put it very clearly with her kind of mastery over the subject. She said that let us not think of exclusion only in the physical sense. Exclusion is fundamentally an exclusion through the mechanism of social semiotics, through a kind of technology of signification. What is significant and what is not significant is marked on bodies, while bodies apparently look the same, and yet the women's bodies are marked differently, but women are present. Women are present in the spaces. So the occupation of spaces by bodies is more complicated than how I myself used to think earlier, that it's a simple question of segregation. Now, of course, that does not mean segregation does not happen in societies. Caste society is, in India, a society of segregation. Even Athenian society is also a society of segregation. The household as a space of women and the polis as a space of men is highly spatially segregated. But of course, these segregations are meant to be coercive and terroristic indicators of spaces as they are ideally supposed to be governmentally managed. But actually, with all segregation, there is also some mixture. So in a sense, the interesting thing about spatial organization is how to control the mixture. And that cannot be done merely physically or spatially. That has to be done semiotically. And this liturgical technology is a way of doing that. The second point, which is I think a very interesting point as part of your question, is how does that affect the space of performance? The space of the performers, the musicians, the singers, the dancers. Now, one of the crucial points to be noted here is that most of the performers are themselves non-citizens. They are slaves. The professional performers, though the word professional is anachronistic because there is no wage being paid, there is no salary being paid. So it is cast also in this logic that they are being given the necessary subsistence. So every year the slaves who are performing, the slave performers, they are taken care of by certain rich families of the city. So the rich families of the city are also known to perform liturgies, public service, to take care of the performers' needs, food, clothing, and so on and so forth, is the task of the citizens. So it's not a wage, it is a kind of service. But the space of the performance is dominated by those who are actually not part of the space of the city. And yet, The theatre is an essential point of the city's claim to culture, the city's claim to truth. So that to me is something which is another kind of what Foucault later would call heterotopia, that within the same space there is a heterogeneity. It is part of the city, and yet when slaves occupy it, it becomes heterogeneous. Slaves are not citizens, but slaves are the ones who make the city, the performance work possible. So performance is a kind of service. Performance itself is a kind of liturgy. Just like the Devdasis in the earlier logic of being temple performers. They're performing kind of service, both to society, to the upper caste, and to God. So the slaves are doing the same thing. And at the same time, without them, the city can't function. So this heterotopic logic to me is fascinating. I can go on about it, but I think, we need to stop here. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have two questions. The first question is, it was like fascinating to hear you out, especially when you're comparing the Natya Shastra and the whole work in the Greece. My question is that the technique which you had talked about and also the imitation, in Natya Shastra, specifically in Bharata's Natya Shastra, it has already been mentioned that how we actually enjoy that rasa, and it is basically the imitation of a realistic situation where you abstract that on the stage and then you enjoy it. So how these two are so exactly connected, being especially far from so much, is my first question. And it seems to be the same technique which you are talking about, is imitating that. The second question is that in ancient Greece, all these actors and actresses, they were called thespians. And these thespians were they were regarded as a very specific class, a very specific community, those who used to perform theatre. So even in the democracy, was it a kind of also class creating part? How do you look about it? Thank you.
Thank you. So again, very quickly, two questions, two parts to your question. Now, the first part of your question is a complicated question because you see, let me take the second one first because that's more factual. The thespis is actually again a kind of mythical, a primordial reference to a leading actor or a leading cult of the actor. But like I said, the actors are primarily, you're right, they're from slave communities. Now, insofar as they're from slave communities, the actors must perform, but they are not expected to participate. This is the violent logic of performance. So we have to keep distinguishing between performing and participating. Performing means a certain automatism. If someone can sing as a virtuoso singer, then that virtuosity is not something which is part of consciousness. It is almost like a reflex of the body. Of course, that reflex is created out of a lot of practice, but it is labor. It is the ability to perform a service, but that necessarily doesn't mean that it is reflected or mediated by consciousness. And so that's why in Aristotle there is something fascinating and shocking, which is this. Aristotle asks that should we encourage young citizens, that is young men who are now on the way to becoming citizens, to become professional artists, that is musicians or dancers, actors? And he says no. No, because in itself art is merely a kind of production of work. Thought, which is the task of philosophy, which is the highest task, which is contemplation, not poiesis, but theoria, is what, and to that extent he is absolutely consistent with Plato, is what is proper to the citizens. So the young man must not be concerned with music to the extent that they become professionals. At the same time, who is a philosopher? A philosopher is also someone who is a judge, who is a critic. So a philosopher must be able to critically evaluate a work of art, a song, a play. But how would you be able to do it if you have no idea about what that art is? So this is again a technology of discrimination. You must learn music up to the point that you're able to judge it, but you must not learn it so much that you become a musician. So you see, there's a threshold up to which you must engage with art. If you go beyond a threshold, then you fall into the art itself. But up to a threshold, if you engage with art, then you stay outside art, and yet you constitute a knowledge of art, which enables you to be a philosopher of art. A good philosopher of art must know about music or about art, but he must not become so immersed in art that his love for philosophy gets degenerated to a love of art. This is Aristotle's strategy, and it is even more powerful than Plato, because Plato is still reacting like an ordinary person who is also a philosopher and kind of trying to manage this schizophrenic dual personality in him. Aristotle actually produces a cogent, strategic, philosophical discourse. So that's an answer to what was your first question? I got a bit mixed. Natya Shastra. Natya Shastra. So what exactly about Natya Shastra did you have in mind?
So, like in Natya Shastra,
Yeah.
also that the idea of imitation.
Imitation. Right. Now I get, yeah.
As a technique.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, reality and imitation. Yeah. Now, yeah. See, Natya Shastra is a relatively more clear text, philosophically, but it's not a philosophical text in the same way that Plato's work is philosophical. Because Natya Shastra does not propose, I'm not a scholar of Natya Shastra, but for whatever little I know, and from what I've learned from people who know this better than me, I can only speak from that limited point of view. Nevertheless, this much I can say, that Natya Shastra has a philosophical field. It is a Shastra, it has a knowledge, but at the same time, it does not take a universal philosophical system to be its complete guiding principle. So Natya Shastra lays the principles of Natya, the principles of rasa, the formation of the emotions through a particular stage of specific sanchari bhavs and so on, as principles of art itself. This is not the case with Plato. With Plato, there is, like I said again, that duality. On the one hand, mimesis is external to the object. The object's truth is something which can only be evaluated in terms of its proximity to the idea. So the idea is something, so let's take an example. Plato says, how will a carpenter make a bed? Because the carpenter must have an idea of the bed to make a bed. But that idea of the bed is something which is a philosopher's concern. So the carpenter now needs to find a position which is in between these two things. So the carpenter must have a model of a bed. Now this model of a bed is only a derivative of the idea of the bed. So the idea of the bed has nothing to do with the use of the bed. The idea of the bed is something which is a completely autonomous philosophical reality, and yet without which the bed can't exist. So in that sense, you could say the idea of the bed is mathematical. You can actually draw a plan of the bed as a mathematical schema. An abstraction, exactly, an abstraction whose closest approximation is geometry. Yeah? So that's one part. So mimesis is external. Even making a bed is external to the bed, which is counterintuitive. But this is how Plato writes about it. But I emphasize, Plato also speaks of methexis. So you can also read Plato against the grain, and you can say it is not simply an external mimesis of a bed. All beds, even if you agree or you accept for the moment this strange abstraction called the bed in itself, but all beds, real beds, participate, like you're plunged in a kind of water, you're drowned in water. Hence, in the same way, all beds participate in the idea. So then idea is also something which is a materiality. Idea is also a kind of an envelope of sensations, a milieu of sensations, an environment, an ecology, rather than being a pale abstraction existing God knows where. So again, in Natya Shastra, this kind of pull and push does not arise that much. Natya Shastra is a relatively more transparent text. But of course, Natya Shastra, other problems arise, which are more scientific problems, which is, what is a rasa? What is in the morning we were talking about it. Is it possible to think of a rasa which is not to be deduced from the given rasas? but a new synthesis, a rasa which is, Tagore used to say, itihasa rasa, which arises out of time, which has hitherto not been ever known, not deductively, but through an event. So Natyashastra opens up to these questions, which are also Dionysic, it seems to me. So yeah.
Mention the Hegelian introduction of Dionysus. I just want to know, was there a difference between the Hegelian introduction of Dionysus versus the Nietzschean introduction of Dionysus? And because the Hegelian theory is more of a mental theory, whether the Nietzschean Dionysus was emotional, somehow related to the emotion and modality. So how Hegelian fit that Dionysus into his theory, or what was the contradiction about that?
That's a great question. That's a very good, very important question, very difficult question. So on the one hand, and very few people have noted this, while Nietzsche and Hegel are seen on the two sides of philosophy, but this is a common point of contact. This is a point of contact, that both actually, in a very affirmative way, positive way, refer to Dionysus. In phenomenology, this line, the Bacchanalian orgy and so on and so forth, is a very Nietzschean line, even before Nietzsche. And if you read Hegel literally, then you see in Hegel the language of dialectics, or whatever, the truth, what he calls becoming of truth, is a language of passion. Truth is never in Hegel something which is given as a pre-existent ideal. Truth is plunged in history, in temporality. All truth is becoming. You become true. But yes, at the same time, becoming true has a path. And that path is world historical and reaches up to a certain point, which is a kind of climax. And some people would interpret this in a theological way. That climax is like Christ coming on earth and sacrificing himself on earth. Or it could be also seen through another kind of atheistic theology, which is revolution, like Marx or Marxism, that this end is like a revolution, something which is the end of history. But whatever it is still a historical truth, which for Plato would be a scandal, philosophically. How can there be a historical truth? Now, the interesting thing with Nietzsche is, on the one hand, it seems to me Nietzsche agrees with Hegel. The truth is always something which is a becoming. But the power of Nietzsche's discourse is that he seems to speak of this becoming in such a forceful and such an exorbitant way that he thinks no theory of truth can quite accommodate this becoming. And to that extent, in Nietzsche, you will find that truth is understood again and again as a metaphor. He says, suppose truth is a metaphor. Suppose truth is metonymy. Suppose truth is an effect of language. Suppose truth is a narrative. And then, of course, most problematically, suppose truth is a woman. But again, in saying this, he comes very close to Hegel. You know what Hegel said about women? That women are the irony of a community. Women are not quite part of a community. They are in the community, and yet, like any irony, they are somewhat, they are a kind of problem for any community. They have a deception. So, in that respect, both are responding to a particular social inconsistency, or a kind of a social anxiety with regard to, let's say, women here. But of course, again, Nietzsche's style is different. Nietzsche pushes it to a point which cannot be in any way, captured or economized by any theory of revolution, as in historical revolution, or a theological theory, as in Christianity. So the last book of Nietzsche is, I think, illustrative of this end which can never be a becoming which can never be an ending. So what's his last book? It's called Exe Homo. Exe Homo is a term taken from the Bible. Pontius Pilate, when Christ was condemned, he said, look at this man. Yes, I am also taking part in the trial against him, but he is singular. Look at him. So Nietzsche writes a text called Exe Homo, but is he talking about Christ? No, he's talking about himself. So the last chapter, one of the last chapters of that book is why I am like Dionysus, why I am a destiny. So instead of Hegel, whose climax is all of history, and in that sense all becoming
eventually comes to rest in history. In Nietzsche, all becoming leads to himself, which is the becoming of he becoming mad. But that madness is not simply a physical madness or a mental madness. That madness is also a becoming mad of discourse. Yeah. So this is, I think, something to keep in mind. And yet they are very close to each other in this respect. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
I was thinking like Hegelian,
Yeah.
the construct of cynicism.
Yeah, sure. I'm saying the same thing.
Sort of a transcendental construct of just
Yeah, I'm saying the same thing. All I'm saying is in Hegel, the synthesis is embodied in end of history, whether that be absolute knowledge, which can be translated into a Marxist vision of history, it can be translated into Christian, conservative vision of history. In Nietzsche, that synthesis is not a result. The synthesis is always opened up. It's a becoming. So it's always open. It's a transformation which doesn't end. But a transformation which does not end is also a kind of madness. Either it is a kind of theatre, where theatre is continuously producing masks, or if it is part of life, then life is entering into a zone of madness. Here madness means continuous transformation, which doesn't lead to a result, which is a synthesis, which is a kind of transcendental place of rest.
so Hegel was transcendental, but Nietzsche was
Well, Hegel is not transcendental according to me. Hegel is immanent, but that immanence has a certain kind of philosophy of history which has elements of transcendence, but that elements of transcendence is also a question mark. How the transcendence is to be achieved, Hegel did not give a clear picture of that. Yeah, but in Nietzsche, the immanence goes subterranean. It doesn't go out into the world. It goes into under the ground, underground. Yeah, that underground can be seen as his psyche, as his life, his mental condition, or it can be, according to me, more interestingly seen as the underground of discourse itself. That is the discourse of philosophy.
Question. So that is the which in the larger issue of your talk, which is relationship between the art and truth. So just want a clarification, your opinion over the hermeneutics interpretation of art, where when I see the theatre or any piece of artistic work, so I'm interested because it helps me to understand myself better. So I'm interested in say Ramayana or in any kind of the epic, because it helps me to understand, because for me the existence is an issue. So when I see the people also involved in the similar situation of the tragic and of other kind of unresolved situation, so my interest is precisely because of the truth, because I want to understand myself better. So how do you see this?
Yeah, that's an important point. Any hermeneutic relationship will have to have at least a partial autonomy of, though not an entire autonomy, not a total autonomy, but a partial autonomy of something like a reader, something like a spectator, where the text is at least partially accessible to this reader or the spectator, so that a relationship can be created through an act, of course, not passively, but through an act, and that act is always historical, yeah, which is also dialectical. Yeah. So this is a very important theory to keep in mind. I have no difficulty with that. But what I'm pointing towards, that's why I take the Greek period. I say that the problem comes back with Hegel and Nietzsche, Kant, Hegel and Nietzsche. But the Greek period is far more emphatic in its rejection of any kind of a subject. Because you see, the problem is, if you have a subject that is a human subject, a hermeneutic subject, then that subject will have to be an abstract subject. It has to be an anthropological subject. But ancient Greek anthropology is not an anthropology of all human beings. It's an anthropology of ancient Greece, of Athens. So to that extent, all philosophy must be a philosophy which politically must, in a sense, arise out of this kind of a, sons of the soil theory, Athenian soil. But at the same time, it must reach a certain kind of universality, which Plato is attempting to do, not through the human subject, but through something which has the impersonality of mathematics, the impersonality of philosophy as closest to mathematics. The moment you have a human subject, you need that human subject to be universalizable beyond Athens. beyond being a man, beyond being only a citizen. That Plato cannot do, that Aristotle cannot do. So to that extent, their cultural and their social ideologies are definitely a real constraint. A free man and a slave cannot have the same capacities. But of course, you can always say that in his text Meno, after all, the slave Meno, the slave is able to perform all the geometrical moves through a kind of exercise of recollection. So even a slave can, in a sense, recollect the universal rules of thought. That is true. That is true. But insofar as he does it, he must also be freed from that slave, that slave moment. You know. So and it can only be done as a recollection. The slave cannot really be taught consciously. The slave can only be taught through exercise, mechanically. You can only make the slave go through a process of recitation, not a hermeneutic process which requires understanding. A universal subject with basic understanding, with a kind of Kantian apparatus. This with ancient Greeks is not possible. Hence Heidegger makes this, this whole archaeology of the subject, which in ancient Greece reaches an impasse, that there is no subject there. Subject and substance can't be understood in the same way that you understand with modern philosophy. So that is the only, and that's why, just to end this point, with Aristotle you have a theory of catharsis, but you don't have a theory of the spectator. There is nothing in Aristotle's Poetics to say that catharsis happens to the spectator, which to our common sense is quite absurd. How can catharsis happen to anyone else but the spectator? But in Aristotle's own text, he will not talk about a spectator. He will talk about the very existence of that potential of catharsis in the plot, in the very structure. So again, it's impersonal. Just like for Plato, mathematics is a kind of impersonal space of truth. For Aristotle, poetry becomes an impersonal space of that structure of catharsis. Suppose he said catharsis is meant for the human being, then any human being, no? But he can't say it. But he can't also give a definition saying that catharsis is only meant for the Greek citizen. That he can't say. Now, Natyashastra is a different kind of a text. Natyashastra doesn't talk about these sorts of definitions. So you have a concept of Sahridaya, which is already a kind of medium, a middle term. So yeah, so these are the philosophical questions, problems. Yeah.
Could you please name some reliable books on Greek art and aesthetics?
Well, there are several books. Let me just name the ones I have referred to here. Yeah. So there is a very good, there's an excellent compendium called the Cambridge Companion to Greek Tragedy, in which Paul Cartledge has an essay called Deep Plays, and then P. Esterling has a text called A Show for Dionysus. A Show for Dionysus. Now, if you want to read about this liturgical logic that I spoke about, I have in my own book, it is there, but apart from that, Pericles' speeches are already available in English translation as part of Thukydides, the great Greek historian's book called History of Peloponnesian, the History of the Peloponnesian War, which is of course the war between Athens and Sparta at that time. Yeah. So Penguin has a whole, Penguin Classics has a, it's a very reliable, yeah. So you can read about Pericles and what Pericles used to make these funeral orations, in which he used to talk about the greatness of Athenian culture, in which all these liturgical features come. So you can get that in History of Peloponnesian War. That's the primary source.
Does truth serve a purpose?
Sorry.
Any purpose? Does truth serve any purpose?
Yes. That is absolutely crucial. In Plato, truth serves a purpose. Truth is part of the education of the guardians. The Republic, which is the main text about these things, is not an abstract text about merely truths in the. So one of the things we must note is, I didn't have the time to speak about this, the genre of Plato's dialogues. Plato writes dialogues. Aristotle, of course, writes in the style that we are used to, which is a descriptive, discursive style of philosophy, an academic style. Plato writes in a creative style. He writes dialogues. So, the dialogue between Socrates and several other partners in his dialogue is oriented to ultimately discuss what is good for the city, what serves the city. So, truth must serve the city. The only question is how. How? Will it serve the city practically? No. It must serve the city philosophically. But philosophy is serving the city. That's why I keep saying citizen caste, and caste is always service. Brahmins are known as service, so they're kind of Athenian Brahmins out there. Brahmins are known for service, but a kind of service. Shudras, service, but another kind of service. And between the two services, there's a violent hierarchy. So philosophy is also service, slavery is also service, but between the two, there is violent hierarchy. So absolutely, truth serves. And that is the difference between Hegel partly and say someone like Plato. Plato on the one hand speaks of, universal theory and mathematics and all that. But ultimately Plato's interest is in governing the city. While Hegel, while he is part of Germany and all kinds of French Revolution and so much is going on around him, ultimately Hegel will speak of world history. He will not speak of merely Germany, merely France, merely this country or that country. He will speak of world history. So world history is not some one city to serve, no? So Hegel will say truth becomes or forms itself ultimately historically in such a way that all of history comes to a certain rational, true conclusion. Now, of course, that is highly idealistic. But whatever it is, it still talks of service at the level of something so large that it can't be service of a city, service of one place, service of one master. But yes, in Plato, truth serves the city. Absolutely. So truth is political.
Say that the idea of truth is biased towards service. Is there a bias in that sense?
Yes, absolutely. In Plato, there is a bias. There is a bias towards his own class. There is a bias towards philosophy itself. But the only problem is that this bias is so, that bias itself is philosophized in such a minute and subtle way that you see the result of that, no? His main hero, his protagonist, who does what he does, which is philosophize in the city, is so biased, totally biased towards Athens, is put to death by Athens. Isn't that a tremendous contradiction? The same man who says, I will not leave this city because this is the only city in which one can live a human life, is being put to death by that very city. So it's a love of country, love of city, love of nation, and yet that nation is killing him. But he will not leave the nation, not because this regime of the nation or that regime of the nation, because of an entire understanding which is a philosophical understanding of that particular city, that whatever, that polis, let's use the Greek word, polis. What is polis? Polis is constitution, something constituted, not just given in nature, but something which I make out of nature into a form. And so philosophical logic is, Socrates is saying that the only formed place is Athens, and yet that formed place is putting him to death. So this is the irony of his bias. He's totally biased, but that bias is in a strange sense a self-inflicted wound. Yeah.
So with this is the end of our question answer session, and I request Hari Krishna, who is Doctor Research Scholar in NIAS ESP, to give final vote of thanks.
Thanks, Saurabh. At the outset itself, let me express my
gratitude and thankfulness to Swasti Rasabodhini coordinators for giving me this opportunity to give vote of thanks. So on behalf of NIAS Consciousness Studies programs, I would like to thank Professor Soumyabrata Choudhury for giving a thought-provoking and insightful lecture. And my thanks also goes to Dr. Saurabh for chairing the session. And also, I'm indeed grateful to our director, Dr. Shailesh Nayak, Professor Sangeeta Menon, Head of Consciousness Studies Program, NIAS Administration, and Consciousness Studies Program team members for making this session a success. And last but not the least, I would like to thank all the audience for making this session very enriching. And I hope this discussion continues outside also. Thank you.